All right. Hi, everyone. How do you follow that? And also this entire weekend. It's such an honor to be here. For a little context, can you all hear me? Yeah. So I teach French at Harvard, and I have been a Prince fan since high school. I grew up down the highway from Paisley Park. And we used to talk about people spotting him at Target and being like, "Who's that fancy old lady?" "Oh, that was Prince." Okay. And then we had this running joke of like, anytime you see a limousine go by, you're like, "There he goes." And then I sort of entered this world of Prince scholarship through his fashion, and then that launched me into more fashion studies. So it's a pleasure to be here. It brought me out to London last week, where I got to talk about Prince as a dandy at this New Masculinities and Beau Brummel conference. So that was a really exciting thing. So thank you for allowing me to do this wonderful research and be part of this amazing community. And again, thank you to D'Angela. That's amazing. Thank you so much, D'Angela. Always bringing it. I'm always so honored and overwhelmed to be invited here, and her staff, all of the volunteers, right? And special shout out to Cam. Where's Cam? Thank you, Cam. He brought the images every year. He always hooks me up with all the great images. So thank you so much. So when D'Angela first asked me to present on Sheila E. and her style aesthetic in the Glamorous Life, let's see here. Oop, that down. Yep. I thought about the ways her style is iconic during this era. She has the extremely large coiffed hairstyle. It's very 80s. The lace bodysuits, strands of pearls on her hats, the angular, heavily shoulder-padded jackets, right? Some of which include tails. I was intrigued by this skirt-free aesthetic. And she's really only seen in either pants, or she calls them culottes, or with the exception of some kind of Prince-like bikini briefs, or the absence of clothing on her lower half. And of course, this is due to the intense physicality required to perform on these percussion instruments and drum sets. And we all heard the incredible Von Terry last night. I'm still buzzing from this. Honestly, thank you so much for bringing him. I don't know what magic you did to get him here, but that is literally the highlight of any Prince symposium I've ever been to for me. I'm still buzzing off of that. So I had a lot to think about with that whole thing. I'm going to rewatch that a million times. But anyway, he says, quote, "Glamorous drummer with high functionality," right? She's got those pockets for her drumsticks, which is so cool. But in the end, we all know from the title of my talk that I chose to discuss her luxurious fur coat. And boy, did I go careening down a rabbit hole. So let's do this. All right. So the first line, oh yeah, and here's, this is from last night. You saw these incredible images, and there was just an amazing amount of stuff that I've never seen before last night. So again, thank you. So, you have the first line of lyrics in the song highlights this long fur coat of mink that she wears even in the summertime, just to show that she is living the glamorous life. Why is the mink coat so connected to our Western ideals of glamour? What are some of the implications of wealth, luxury, and social prestige attached to this coat? And how has it also been eroticized? Also, around the same time as this coat was first, the song was first released, in September of 1984, Greenpeace International announced in England that it would launch a campaign against the fur trade with the intention of, quote, shaming the wearers of fur coats off the streets. So what are some of the sociocultural and political debates around this clothing item, and who is allowed to wear fur? When we understand fashion as a form of communication, what are the semiotics engaging in the language of glamour, and especially women wearing fur? How do these cliches and assumptions evolve throughout the 20th century? And what are we meant to understand when we see Black and brown women wearing fur? I realize, I only have 20 minutes, but let's just venture down this rabbit fur hole together as we attempt to read this garment. I had to do it, you know. Prince likes cheesy jokes, right? Okay, so first, let's start with the idea of fur as glamorous. So we see Sheila E. in her fur coat in this erotic street scenes in the video with some violence and all while she's wearing this fur coat. And she also uses the fur coat as sort of a costume prop during that AMA 1985 performance of The Glamorous Life, right, where she dons the coat halfway through the number for a brief moment to grand applause. And then we see this engagement with the fur coat as an iconic move on stage with Aretha Franklin, as she would famously drop the coat as dramatic gesture to match her ascension to higher vocal realms. So Aretha was part of a long tradition or long line of famous Black singers wearing fur coats, such as Marian Anderson and Billie Holiday in the 30s and 40s. And, also on the diva level in Sheila's memoir, she mentions, quote, "I walked through the airport looking every bit the star, like taking my glamorous life role a bit too seriously, flanked by security, wearing a fur coat, sunglasses, and in head-to-toe couture." So this coat, paired with sunglasses, truly emanates glamour for Sheila E. in this new role as solo artist. And the implications of fur as glamorous for women in particular date back to the medieval era, and glamour was associated with fur throughout the 20th century until the 1990s. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines glamour as, I'm just paraphrasing, enchanting and magical. I saw those words in the definition. So that, of course, has connotations of sorcery and witchcraft, right? And these terms are associated with controlling women, and particularly women's sexuality. So in Julia Emberley's seminal book, The Cultural Politics of Fur, she contextualizes this history in Britain, quote, "Legislative acts in medieval Britain sought to regulate the wearing of fur as a symbol of land-owning wealth and class privilege. They also sought to regulate material consumption in general by introducing a moral discourse on the detrimental effects of material excess." So these are sumptuary laws, right? This discourse became increasingly linked throughout the 16th and 17th centuries with controlling women's sexuality and the outward signs of gender and adornment. So not only was fur a significant commodity fetish during the rise of the fur trade between Britain and the New World in the 17th century, the link between sexual and material excess contributed to fur's signification as a sexual fetish. The symbolic and material fetishisms ascribed to fur, and especially the fur-clad upper-class white European woman, were further supported by an aesthetics of adornment, fashion, and style. And that's a lot to unpack. When we talk about fur, women, and eroticism, we cannot avoid dissecting the fetish of fur, as Emberley clearly states. So in the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud brought up whether or not we like what he says, right? The fetishistic aspect of fur in his psychoanalysis work has proliferated in culture, right? So Freud essentially defines a fetish as a replacement for the phallus, an object on which the erotic desire is fixated. Hashtag musically, right? So essentially, Emberley states that fur fetishism, as Freud defined it, it serves as a surrogate for the phallus, the necessity of which helps control the fear of castration and ensures visual pleasure. So additionally, in his 1927 treatise, Fetishism, Freud theorizes that the fur fetish could also be interpreted as a longing for the female sex and associating the tactile texture of fur with pubic hair. And yeah. This is a Prince conference, you guys. Come on. In his view, fur and velvet, as has long been suspected, are a fixation of the site of the pubic hair, which should have been followed by the longed-for site of the female member. So this is in line with Prince all the way through, right? And Freud elaborates on an imagined moment in which fur could be perceived as this disavowal of the mother's castration by the ostensible image of a little boy peering at his mother as she is changing from below. Whether you believe that or not, it's what we have for fetishism and the theory of it, right? So negotiating these ideas of the fur as fetish translates to the concept of fashion as a mode of communication, right? A series of signs and symbols to be read or semiotics. So in addition to representing libidinal desires and the sexual fetish, the fur coat became a symbol of wealth, bourgeois power, social prestige, and consumption. So Hollywood shared greatly in this proliferation of the symbolism of fur, showcasing starlets and fur coats and further eroticizing the garment. In Fur, A Sensitive History, Jonathan Fayers describes cinema's construction of the immoral and ineligible woman in Hollywood. So the cliche, of course, was that fur coats were ostensibly only lawfully attained by women, either as a gift from a guilty spouse or by a lover for illicit sexual activity, right? In the Glamorous Life video, we notice the fur coat only really appears during the black and white scenes of the street storyline. Sheila emerges from the backseat of a luxury vehicle, implying she has someone driving for her, and she's in her long fur coat of mink, similar to like a Hollywood star at a red carpet event. After purchasing flowers from a vendor on the street, the tone changes as a man approaches her and they engage in some erotic flirtation, which eventually leads to a violent turn of affairs. And so, in between some ostensible consensual affection, there's some hair pulling in the moonlight. Her fur coat falls off her shoulders to the ground. Fayer states that film both reflected and initiated fashions in fur, especially those that contributed to a specific black and white form of glamour. So longer-haired, pale or white furs, which framed famous screen faces and photographed well, became fashionable. And Fayers continues this libidinal interpretation of fur as providing another, quote, another level of primitive sexual intensity, especially when juxtaposed with shimmering or diaphanous fabrics such as sequins, marabou feathers, white net, and black lace. So although we don't get to see much of a glimpse of what she's wearing beneath her fur coat in the black and white scenes in the video, shimmering is a pretty perfect descriptor for her in-studio outfit. And we all saw Von Terry's original jacket, amazing. And Mink, and so it's a flash of like pink and leopard print, also related to the subtext surrounding the fur coat. So Mink was perfect for this, as obviously aforementioned many times in the lyrics. And Fayers explains how by the 1940s, Mink had become marked as this pinnacle of esteem and desire thanks to Hollywood. And I'll wrap up this analysis of fur in cinema via Fayers' book with his statement that, quote, as a status symbol, a sign of having made it on film, the mink coat was unassailable and its economic value rarely challenged. So this garment is always worth something. But if its monetary value goes unquestioned, it is often acquired by additional emotional, sexual, or moral expenditure. So going back to the fur coat in the video, the sexual violence, reaches its height as Sheila and the man on the street are struggling before the same building, now ablaze, until they enter inside and the narrative ends. So in the 1920s, we have James Van Der Zee's iconic photos of the Jazz Age in Harlem, featuring many Black women proudly donning their fur coats. Fayers explains that the fur coat often signaled achievement and self-worth in marginalized communities, particularly in African-American communities. So this concrete symbol of wealth and success represented a commodity, something that could and would be inherited as a sign of making it. So the fur coat in this context really contrasted with other benchmarks of success, such as home ownership, which was often impossible with the discriminatory bank loaning and housing regulations that persist today. But the fur coat could signify personal prosperity, retain its value. Unlike other symbols of wealth and luxury that are worn, the fur coat is always the outer layer, never hidden when its wearer is moving about in public spaces. So you're the object of observers in society, and everyone can see your mink coat, right? So we see this continuation of the mink as a legendary symbol of wealth and glamour with the Black Glamour Mink ad campaign featuring iconic Black legends such as Diana Ross. In addition to Aretha Franklin's association with the fur coat in her performances, we continue to see the importance of fur coats with Black superstars such as Mary J. Blige, Lil' Kim, as styled by Misa Hilton, Cardi B, and of course Sheila E, who we all know, as you rightly pointed out, that she's Creole French and African descent, father's Mexican American and First Nation. She's got that in there too. We'll get to that in a second. So, in addition, we cannot ignore the importance of the fur coat in queer culture. For example, Jenny Livingston's seminal Paris is Burning documentary presents this in the ballroom scene in New York City in the 1980s. And in these spaces, Black and Latinx queer youth would gather and perform in different categories, ranging from voguing to femme realness to deconstruct and reconstruct gendered identities on their own terms in this space. So Livingston features femme realness queens as well as men wearing fur coats in the category competitions as a way of disrupting the exclusivity of female bodies and the wearing of fur. So while the fur coat has constituted, yeah, a sign of status from the devout churchgoer to the hip hop superstar, the issues surrounding who was legally allowed to obtain and wear a fur coat since Europe and Britain during the Middle Ages persisted in Hollywood, playing in the fear of fluidity of social, sexual, financial, racial mobility in a white supremacist society. So we have the blaxploitation films of the 1970s. Of course, we talked a lot about that. We're featuring these, the fur-clad hustlers and their female entourage, both reflected and stirred the fear of white culture that Black Americans were gaining power. So these sumptuary laws have persisted, right? These laws intended to restrict personal expenditures on extravagance or luxury. In the 1980s, the question surrounding who could and could not wear fur manifested yet again with the animal rights movement gaining traction during Greenpeace's and Lynx's visually arresting ad campaigns, not to mention PETA's intense attacks to follow. So New York Times journalist Jasmine Sanders' article from 2019, A Black Legacy Wrapped Up in Fur, chronicles African-American women's relationship with fur and observes that these movements and laws seem to be surfacing at a time when Black women are finally finding themselves in a moment where many can afford to wear fur. And she's quoting Paula Marie Seniors, professor at Virginia Tech in there. And hence, this is not only an attack on women, but specifically Black women. And Sanders quotes, so often the commercial habits of Black people are demonized. So while this analysis, it does ignore in the article, I mean, it's a short article, it ignores that women in fur in the Harlem Renaissance is featured in Van der Zee's photography. And then, of course, those wearing fur during the Reconstruction, as we saw that photo of the woman with it around her neck, right, in the late 19th century. So these ostensible environmentalist attacks on the fur industry do require substantial critique. So what's really going on here? Of course, the violent ad campaigns by these environmental groups are almost unanimously vulgar and misogynistic in tone. Emberly states that, quote, the image of the fur-clad bourgeois woman in the Lynx campaign is full of contradictions. It depicts bourgeois, middle-class, female consumers as morally responsible for the exploitation and oppression of other animals and humans and animals, even if politically and economically they're largely denied access to such realms of power, according to Emberly. So Margaret Thatcher's London was saturated with demonizing images of fur-clad women. So we all recognize, these public scenes of animal rights activists throwing paint and or condiments on unsuspecting fur-clad women in a similar vein as that, those recent soup-throwing trends in art masterpieces in elite museums by, climate change activists. So I'm thinking of like the Mona Lisa in 2013 or 2023, someone threw some onion soup at it. So while these acts garner much media attention, the complex stories surrounding the fur industry and the power structures in place with both the fabricators in the industry and the consumers were not really granted the full view. So, I myself, I must admit that I had quite a few assumptions surrounding the politics of fur. But in researching this project, I came to devour and discover the complexities ingrained in these debates and the potential cultural harms of reducing the problem to these bite-sized moments in the media. And that's what we're all here to do about Prince, right? It's complex. We want to talk about it. We don't want him to be reduced to just Purple Rain, right? So in addition to the erasure of the cultural implications of success and status among Black Americans in a historically oppressive racist society, imperialist problematics abound in relation to Indigenous communities and their relationship to fur. So, for example, the Canadian government responded to the discussions of prohibiting fur by exploiting their Inuit population's economic reliance on the fur trapping industry. So Fayers discusses the Inuit fur trapping trade through the lens of the fur seal. Hunting and using the entirety of the animal was fundamental to these societies, particularly in the 19th century when the Western fashions that popularized the fur seal brought the animal almost to extinction. Fayers points out that, quote, seal hunting, as in the 19th century, has been at the center of controversy since the 1980s. Those interested in the preservation of Inuit culture regarded the activities of anti-fur organizations such as Greenpeace as yet another example of non-indigenous imperialist interference. And so these interventions causing sealskin prices to tumble. This, in turn, had a devastating effect on Inuit, Dene, and other First Nations peoples who depended on seal fur harvesting. So because indigenous fur trappers make up a small proportion of the entire fur industry in Canada, laws could be created to regulate the mass market trading of fur, with exceptions for these communities, of course. So this debate really continues today. And so the U.S. banned all imports of seal products from 1972, but continues to allow a limited period of harvesting of Pribilof. I'm not sure the pronunciation. It's not in French, so I don't know the pronunciation. This type of fur seals by indigenous islanders. And in the European Union, the ban was made official in 2009. So the issue, of course, surrounding the environmental cost of fur is not limited to animal rights. So the substitution of real fur with fake fur is part of a larger problem contributing to climate change due to the amount of petroleum or plastic that the fibers contain. So the fashion industry is the second largest contributor to climate change, according to Magdalene Sabai, after the oil industry. So which is connected, right? Petroleum, oil, plastics, all part of that same industry, right? So many of these clothing items end up in landfills due to the proliferation of fast fashion since the early 2000s. So fast fashion, or the constant renewal of trends for affordable prices, began with Zara in the 1980s and relies on rapidly recreating styles from luxury fashion houses, as well as labor exploitation, including child and forced labor overseas. So not only is the rapid consumption of fashion trends contributing to climate change, it also perpetuates the dangerously unregulated labor conditions in some of these factories. So in the end, what are we to make of Sheila E.'s long fur coat of mink? So the fur coat is a compliment. It's a complicated garment to read, right? Freud's theory of the fur fetish, when applied to the fur coat as an object of wealth and status, radiates with libidinal desire for a perceived lack of said wealth, status, and of course sex, in line with the consumerist culture in capitalistic society. The coat inspires unlimited discussions on morality, attracting never-ending fashion policing, right? However, she looks amazing, right? So there's some sparkle to the glamour emanating from the wearer and the cultural subtext we can read in relation, especially to the Black American culture since Reconstruction, right? The fur coat as commodity, often acquired secondhand, whose value is retained as a luxury object to be passed down, not thrown in some landfill, right? It's to be passed down as inheritance is in itself a gesture towards slow fashion. So, when all is said and done, Sheila's a total star, and that coat is a manifestation of her star power. And I just want to end with that image of Von Terry last night strolling in his best Detroit walk across this floor as he said, and I quote, "You're not a star without the clothes on." Thank you.